Hey everyone, this is Fran from the 5-Minute Modeler, where I provide trains in motion, tips, and tricks as I build out my model railroad. Join me on this journey, and as always, your comments are most welcome. I've modeled in both HO and N scale and currently model in N scale. If you find this video helpful, check out my other videos and subscribe and hit that like button. In this video, I continue the series on building out the Mackinaw City Ferry Docks. To this point, I've built the framing, added insulation foam, carved out our lakefront area, built the Chief Wawadam ferry ship and apron, and laid the track. In this video, we'll be painting the track and wiring the module, which will work for both DC and DCC. I decided to airbrush the rail on the module. I used a dual action airbrush and I'm still learning the ins and outs of it. I'm using raw umber acrylic craft paints and thinning it with isopropyl alcohol at 70%. I mix the paint thoroughly and then strain it through a fine mesh strainer to remove any large pieces of pigment that might clog the airbrush. I'm using 40 pounds of pressure from my compressor as well. I started out by masking the points of the switches. I didn't want paint to get into those. I then created a very thin mixture of paint to IPA, and after spraying several coats, realized I needed more paint. After some experimenting, I was able to get a mixture that did a good job of covering without clogging the airbrush. I painted both the ties and the rails inside and out. I also sprayed from both sides of the module, as it is likely that this module will be worked from either side. If this was going to be in a more permanent location, where it would only be viewed from one side, I would only paint the side that could be seen. Painting track is a great way to add additional realism to your layout. Most flex track and sectional track are molded in black plastic. At this point, the track looks to be a monochrome color, but prior to ballasting, I'll be running some darker paint along the rails with the brush. Then we'll come back later and add additional weathering. Once the paint had dried, after about 10 minutes, I wanted to make sure I cleaned the rail tops of any paint. I did this with a strip of masonite that I had, and I ran it back and forth along the rails. For the switches, I removed the tape and made sure the points and rails were clear of any paint. Next, we're going to go on to the wiring, and the module is going to have one track entering and 3 destination tracks. The engines will not be permitted on the apron or the ship per the prototype rules, so I didn't need to wire those 2 areas. I identified areas where I would solder the wires to the rails for each piece of flex track I had, and since the rail joiners were soldered to the flex, I felt that the switches would carry the current. If at some point I run into a problem, I can always solder a feeder onto a switch. I just don't like to do that if I don't have to. There are several other methods in attaching feeds to your track, including pre-wired rail joiners or soldering to the bottom of the rails. I drilled small holes between the ties where I wanted to run the feeders. In total, there were 10 wires. The drill bit I had wasn't long enough to go all the way through 2 inches of foam, so I used a straightened out paper clip to finish the hole. One of the holes landed right on top of the frame, so I needed to move it over to another spot. Had I looked at where the hole would end up, I likely would have noticed and moved the hole first. Once the holes were drilled, I cleaned the rail where I would solder the feeder. I used the pointed end of a small jeweler's file to remove the paint and make sure I had a clean surface to solder to. I didn't need a big spot, only about 1/8 inch or so. For wiring, I'm using 14 gauge solid copper for my bus wire. These run the length of the module and exit out a pre-drilled hole on the end that will attach to the layout. For the feeders, I used 2 wire types. One was 20 gauge stranded wire, the other was 20 gauge solid copper wire. Some folks will say that you should only use stranded wire for feeders because they could break and create problems. Well, I've used both over the years and I've never had a problem with solid wire. As long as you leave enough to allow for adjustments, you should be okay. The only problems I've had actually is where I had a bad solder joint that came apart. And after all, we're building a model railroad, not a nuclear submarine. I like to tin my wires and rails before I go to soldering them. This way I can focus on one part at a time and I at least feel like I'm being more efficient. For my feeder wires, I cut them to the length of about 12 inches. This is probably a little bit more than I needed, and I probably could have gone to 9 inches. For the stranded wire, I twisted the wire multiple times to make it a tighter wind. I then heated the wire, then applied the solder, allowing it to soak into the wires before removing the soldering iron. I'm using a 25-watt Weller iron, which seems to take a bit more time to heat the rail and solder, so you might have better success with something a little hotter. On one end of each feeder, I made a 1/8 inch 90-degree bend in the wire. This will be the portion that gets soldered to the rail. For all the feed wires, I tinned these with solder in advance. Now that I have the wires tinned, I need to tin the rails in the spots where the feeders will get soldered to. This will make for a quicker and cleaner join. I heated the rail and then applied the solder to the spot. This is one of those do as I say, not as I do times. I should have used some type of heat sink or even a wet paper towel on the rail where I was soldering. This would have kept some of the heat from melting the ties near the solder joint. With the rails and wires tinned, I can now solder the feeder to the rails. I took one wire at a time and fed it into the pre-drilled hole all the way through the foam. In some cases, I was able to pull the wire from the underside of the foam. I held the wire against the rail with the tool that came with the soldering iron, not sure what it's called, but it allows me to hold the wire tight while the iron heats the solder and fuses the two together. Again, heat sinks or a damp paper towel would have controlled the heat a bit better. Once all the feeders were soldered to the rails, I flipped the module on its side and connected the feeders to the appropriate bus wire. There's all kinds of connectors available these days. I haven't used them, but they seem to make the job of connecting feeders a bit easier. But that said, I removed about 1 inch of insulation from the bus wires where I was going to solder the various feeders and tinned the wire. I wrapped the feeder wires around that spot and soldered the wires to the bus wire, then covered up the bare wire with electrical tape. So here are my tips for successful soldering. Number 1, have a clean, shiny tip. Number 2, tin the tip with fresh solder. Number 3, clean the surface to be soldered. Number 4, tin rail and wire both. Number 5, use a heat sink on the rail to disperse the heat. And number 6, press the wire against the rail and hit it with the hot iron. I flipped the module back and then using a bit of Eileen's glue, I filled each of the holes around each feeder wire. This will prevent ballast from falling through when I get to that point. Now for the true test. Did I wire it correctly? It's easy to mix it up. I get out my old Troller DC power pack and a couple of older DC engines that I had from my earlier layouts. These engines hadn't run in years, so I wasn't expecting much. But to my surprise, they ran pretty smoothly through the switches and track. I found a couple of places that still had some paint on the rail, but overall it ran well. So I'm thinking that I'm about halfway to completing this module. But now that we have the foundation built, we can start to build out the scenery, and this is where it's going to start to really come together. So thanks for following along with my journey, and leave your comments if you'd like. Have a great week, and we'll see you on the next episode.